Oh my goodness, you are such an inspiration. Wow, you really are. You're so strong. Can I pet your service dog? Ugh. 1, 2, 3, let's go! We are artists, parents, teachers, good guys, bad guys, students, leaders. I'm not your inspiration, yeah, I'm fully who I am. Got my own expectations that don't fit into your plans. I'm not your sad story, so I wrote it in this song. Everything you know about disability is wrong. Yeah, everything you know. Yeah, everything you know about disability is wrong.
Hey listeners, welcome to another episode of Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong. Today on the podcast, we have a very exciting episode with one of my favorite comedians, Steven Verdile. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So Steven is the founder of the Squeaky Wheel, a nonprofit organization that empowers disabled writers to use humor to combat ableism, and it's the first ever satire publication focused on disability.
Steven is also a leader at NBC Universal's My Abilities group. We're so excited to have you. Before we get into the actual interview portion, let's go ahead and do our audio descriptions. I can start. This is Lily speaking. I am a white-passing multiracial woman with half blonde, half black hair, split straight down the middle, Cruella de Vil style. I'm wearing a black turtleneck and a little kind of holiday kind of sweater, and the necklace that I will fidget with throughout the course of the entire episode. To you, Erin.
Hi, this is Erin. I am a white woman with red hair and blue eyes, and I have a black shirt on, and it blends in with my background, so I look like a floating head. And I'll pass it to Steven.
Hi, I am a white wheelchair user. I have brown hair, a long beard, some glasses, a blue sweater, and a name tag that I forgot I was wearing, in case y'all forget who you're talking to. Yeah, excited to be here.
Love the name tag. Maybe we should make all of our guests start wearing them. We should just all have name tags. Well, we're super excited for you to be here today. We are big fans of the Squeaky Wheel and the work that you do. So let's get into it. Erin, take us away.
So the name of our podcast is Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong. And we always ask our guest, what do people get wrong about you?
So I think one thing that people get wrong about me and about kind of a lot of disabled people in general is that there is a hesitancy to be silly and make jokes about disability, or that jokes about disability are offensive or could be hurtful. That is certainly the case in some instances, particularly based on sort of the intentions and who they're coming from. But what I love to talk about in all of my work is sort of how humor actually brings people together, how it can make difficult, sensitive topics more relatable, more acceptable, and really can get people to see disability in an entirely new light.
Totally.
I love that. I love that so much because it goes into what I think comes up a lot on this show, which is like that people have almost assumptions of like fragility.
Totally.
And we're funny. I think it's really important to share that. And a lot of my favorite comedians are disabled and friggin' hilarious, and people don't necessarily tie those words together always. So I appreciate you starting us off with that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people too think that disabled people don't know they're disabled or don't realize they're disabled, or people think they don't understand the way they're perceived, when it couldn't be further from the truth that like most of us are hyper aware of how we're perceived and in what ways we're different, in what ways we're similar. Um, I think that there is a real misunderstanding there.
Yeah, and I think also like people assume when they make jokes about disability that we're putting ourselves down, that is not the case. Like, the response sometimes is, oh, that's not true. Oh, you shouldn't say that. It's like, yeah, it is true. And it's hilarious. And that's fine.
Absolutely. I think it's very empowering to be able to sort of poke fun at your differences and not be sort of ashamed or try and downplay them.
Yeah, in 2024, self-deprecation cannot just be exclusive to non-disabled, cis, straight, white men anymore. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in some ways it's almost like I'm a little bit sick of those comedians doing it because it feels like so artificial when people are self-deprecating and have like the most wonderful, glamorous lives. And I'm like, there are people that like actually have things to be self-deprecating about, and that's actually funny. I think it rings much more true and much more genuine when it comes to people who can speak to sort of actual challenges and struggle in their humor.
I completely agree. Because, like, I feel like a lot of self-deprecation for the sake of self-deprecation ends up, like, almost making fun of doing comedy.
Yep.
And it's like, well, here I am doing comedy. And it's always just so much funnier when someone gets up and it's like, well, here I am doing comedy and I'm dealing with some other shit. Like,
Exactly.
well, so you founded Squeaky Wheel. For any of our listeners that don't know about it, I would love to get an origin story if you have that. Would love the origin story for the hilarious satire publication you've created.
Sure. So for quite a few years before I started the Squeaky Wheel, and just to give context, I started in 2021. So when I graduated college, really around 2018, I was so passionate about humor and comedy, and I knew my voice was sort of a disability voice. It was sort of the lens through which I view everything, and I had so many jokes and stories and things I wanted to share. Um, Working in a TV and entertainment company and really being such a fan of television and film, my instinct was to try screenwriting and then try and write some of these stories and experiences as potential video content. And what I ran up against pretty quickly was realizing that creating video content, whether it be short films or a web series or even sort of really short form like Instagram reel type content, is fairly inaccessible, particularly for someone with my capabilities and skill set. It usually requires a lot of budget, it requires a lot of people, it requires a lot of time. And I realized that all of those sort of barriers were preventing me from being able to tell the jokes and to get them out quickly and timely. And in the 2 years it might take me to make a 4-minute video, I'm already sort of giving up on it or not caring about it or on to the next thing. So I started looking for a way to get these stories out quickly and easily and in a very accessible manner. Um, and that was when I sort of had that aha moment of the short form internet satire websites like The Onion or Ductress or Clickhole, um, that those sort of memeable little short writing pieces are actually super accessible for me. I can write them easily. Um, when I launched the website, I already had written 20 something stories, like banked them all, put them all out at once, just as like, here it all is, just taken from all my scraps and jokes and notes and sort of launched it with that. Um, and what became really exciting and sort of really the core of what Squeaky Wheel is I realized that it wasn't just a more accessible format for me, but it was actually a more accessible format for almost all disabled writers. That there was a lot of disabled people that wanted to be funny and wanted to try comedy, and going out at 10 o'clock every night to a comedy club that's an hour away is like exhausting and not the most accessible. And this was a way for them to get their jokes out there, to try writing, to get experience, but in a way that is super accessible, convenient, and sort of much less ableist and how it's designed friendly. And I think that that has been sort of our core, that we want to make our platform a place for like new writers and sort of junior disabled comedians to really get a chance to put some jokes into the world.
Oh, it's so good. Like it's so good because it's like a double kind of mission of the like putting funny stuff out there, but that also that layer of giving people their start is cannot be undervalued, I think, because the barriers to entry in comedy are really hard. Like it's feels like if you don't have something published, it's impossible to get anything published. And that one story can be the thing that like really gives you that credibility. So I think you're doing some incredible work in terms of helping the comedy world be a more inclusive space.
Yeah, I know you mentioned that you perform stand up. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that to get into a comedy writer's room, performing stand up is almost always like a prerequisite that you have to be a performer first before you can be a writer. Um, I personally never really had interest in performing. I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to write, and I knew that even though I live in Manhattan, like the heart of stand up, it would be so challenging and inaccessible to actually try and pursue it that route. So I think that our platform is sort of a shortcut where you can skip right to the comedy writer's room experience without having to sort of go through that really challenging obstacle.
That's such a good point because even as I was like doing your intro in this episode, I found myself saying like my favorite comedian and then being like, "Oh, does that imply he does stand up?" Because that's not the kind of comedy he does. But then I was like, "No, he's a comedian. Like it's not. You don't have to just do stand up."
It's whatever you want to call me is fine.
But I think it's a good point though because we do tend to think of stand up as the like vehicle for becoming a
Exactly.
true comedian, and I completely agree that I have found it quite inaccessible. And I like everything about an open mic feels like a sensory and physical nightmare to me. So I say I do comedy. I do comedy in one space that I curated and I built to be like a sensory friendly space.
That's awesome.
But I think without realizing it, your work really kind of motivated me to do that because it was like, yeah, I don't actually have to fit myself to these spaces. I can actually just build the spaces, a kind of field of dreams. If you build it, they will come thing.
Yeah, I
And
think
even like calling it stand up feels ableist.
Yeah.
definitely, at least for quite a lot of us.
Should
Um,
just be like microphone comedy.
yeah. I think too, like that experience of building the space rather than finding it, in that sort of journey of going from trying to write video content and screenwriting and all that to what the Squeaky Wheel is, there was a period where I had written the stories and I was thinking of like, can I submit these to the Onion? Like, is there places or can I submit to McSweeney's or all these different? And I was like, I really can't because like their audience just isn't gonna vibe with it. Like it's not for them. And I think that was another real aha moment of like discovering the format being that sort of short form satire, and then discovering how much more powerful it could be to create the platform.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you went with what you did instead of like submitting your pieces
Yeah,
because I think that there's something about even just the publication being called the Squeaky Wheel that gives that like permission that we talked about people sometimes are afraid to laugh at certain things. So it gives that permission and that feeling that like this is by us and for us, and in a way that maybe in another publication the stories wouldn't be. Like, and so the headlines can be outlandish and it's in our community, so it feels like, I think that's an important caveat to the, like, we can make fun of ourselves, we can self-deprecate, we can make comedy about this. It does kind of have to be within some kind of a, like, safe container, I suppose.
Absolutely. I think that, like, I realized too when I was sort of scouring all the other satire websites trying to see, like, if they ever covered disability. What I came across was, like, 5 or 10 stories across the entire internet satire world, that had to do with disability, and several of them I was like, I can't really tell, like, if this even was coming from a disabled person or not. Um, and then I was so delighted to find 2 different disabled writers, one who was writing for The Onion, one who was writing for Hard Times, and seeing that, like, they were doing it, but then it became evident to me that, like, oh, 90% of their work doesn't even mention their disability. Like, they actually can't really lean into it that heavily in their work at those platforms because the audience doesn't know where it's coming from.
That's another really great point about why I think what you're doing is so important for people getting their start, because whenever I'm trying to submit certain comedy to things, unless it feels like a group that does understand the disabled experience, like unless there's other disabled comedians, I have this, like, innate fear of just imagining them being like, oh, another autistic comedian, all of their stuff is going to be about being autistic, like, and kind of, whereas, in the space I've made, we have quite a few autistic comedians and we all do comedy about autism, and it's all different and funny. It's not the same stuff. And I think that the squeaky wheel and the variety of types of content or of stories that come out of your publication show that, like, the collective of disabled comedians together can be a really incredible thing. For any of our readers, any of our viewers and listeners, I think you can kind of get an idea of what the squeaky wheel is based on our conversation so far. But if you're still kind of like, so what do you mean by a satire publication? I have some of my favorite recent headlines to talk about that I love. One of my favorites that I literally sent to so many friends was Ticketmaster requires users to find all 6 Infinity Stones and defeat Thanos to acquire accessible concert seats. I thought it was such a good one because there was so much Ticketmaster stuff coming out at the time and how awful Ticketmaster was, and nothing from the disabled experience, which all I've ever heard is how awful it is to get ADA accessible seats from Ticketmaster.
Yeah, I think that one too is like, there's definitely no other publication that could write a story like that. Like, it very clearly is for a specific audience, and that audience is millions of people, but it's not the general population. So I think that that is awesome. I also love that you mentioned that one because I've had the um, great, like, opportunity to do a lot of podcasts and talk to a lot of people about their favorite Squeaky Wheel stories and which ones sort of resonate with them. And it's always different. Like, I don't think anyone has ever mentioned that one as, like, one that really resonated with them. And I love to hear how, like, everything relates to people differently.
Yeah, I love that one, and I think I love anything that can take, like, a common hardship. Like, there's another one I really like that is it's saying that, like, making a call to CVS is now a BDSM kink. Like, and I truly, like, I actually have a joke that I've done in the past on having to call Walgreens every month and how it's like the little bit of self-harm that I haven't been able to conquer because it's so awful. And it's those kind of moments where it's like, this is something that I could easily do, like, a rant on my Instagram and be like, it's so awful that every month I have to make these calls and do this. And mostly people wouldn't really listen to it. But when I, like, shared that specific post on my story, felt like I got to try to explain, like, a common grievance in my life, how hard it is to just get my medications every month in a way that my disabled followers would be like, haha, I completely understand this. But my followers who maybe don't take medications would be like, oh, I never really thought about that being a bad experience.
Definitely. I think there's a lot of like power to in when a joke like that is published with like a name attached to it. And when I say a name, I just mean like the Squeaky Wheel logo slash brand, whatever you want to call it. It really gives it like a weight that there is a community for it and that people are enjoying it. I think a lot of times people are afraid to make those kind of jokes on their own personal accounts and like attached to their personal face because it feels kind of vulnerable and a little bit like you're just sort of making a joke for the ether and hoping that it resonates. But there's a real validation in publishing it under a publication with a logo and a team, because then when it goes out into the world, even for the people that don't quite understand it, they realize like, oh, it's not that this person is just bonkers and isn't funny. It's just that this isn't for me. This is for other people, and that's why it has 700 likes, and I'm not one of them. Like it really helps to ground the humor in the fact that it is for a group of people. If you don't understand it or don't enjoy it, it's just not for you. It doesn't mean it's poorly done.
Yes, absolutely. I think, yeah, that's really can be the power of comedy in general, but I love that you get specific. Like having a specific audience is actually really powerful. And it does kind of create that sense of community. I mean, I don't think I ever would have shared that like little bit that I do had I not seen it be on the squeaky wheel and then be like, oh, cool. Yeah. I'm not like making a big deal out of nothing. There's a lot of people who relate to this. I think that is kind of a power of social media to like vindicate our daily grievances because there's a lot when you live in an inaccessible world.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you'll make a very disability specific joke in like a more general non-disabled space. Like if I posted a Squeaky Wheel headline that I wrote on my personal Facebook page for my friends and family, like it would bomb. Like it wouldn't. It's not for them. It wouldn't do well. Maybe some of my disabled friends would like it and whatnot, but it it just doesn't work in that climate in that environment. And then the very same joke in a different room can crush.
There's definitely something about writing for the audience that will understand it that is very empowering. And I think, like, I manage the Easter Seals blog, which is all blogs by disabled authors. And I feel like, I've learned so much just by managing that. And I feel like you've probably learned a lot too.
Definitely.
Yeah, because it's like, every experience is so different from disabled person to disabled person that it's just a great learning experience and environment that's very empowering.
Yeah, I think too there's a lot of like specificity and difference just between different disability experiences. It's no coincidence that like I'm a white American wheelchair user, and most of the early other writers that reached out were other white American wheelchair users because they were relating to what I was writing and wanted to share their experiences. And then sort of we had a few neurodivergent writers. A lot of them were younger women, and then all of a sudden there was more interest from young neurodivergent women to start writing for us. And it is one of those things that like there's certain disability spheres that I feel like we're really well integrated in and like we really understand it. We have a lot of writers that are creating content for that world. And then there are others that like we completely don't. So I'll say I think I'm pretty sure out of our 50 or so contributing writers, we've only had one who's deaf. and the deaf population is massive. The deaf population is also very sort of isolated and different from a lot of the rest of the disability community. They have their own sense of humor, they have their own culture that is very different, and her stories resonate really well with them. My stories do not, for the most part. I think some disability experiences are more general, but a lot of them are quite specific, and it really is valuable to have that kind of diversity and specificity within the community because you start to hit sort of the even more niche audiences within an already sort of minority audience.
Yeah, whenever disability gets categorized as like a kind of niche subject, I'm like, niche? It's the only identity status that every type of person could have. Like,
Oh
there's
yeah,
a million different intersections and ways that our disabilities affect us. So I think like there's whole, yeah, ecosystems within. And I think that it's a real waste for like producers and people who are like high up in entertainment to think that like there's a disability story.
oh yeah, there's thousands of it, and there's not even, at least eh, from the way I see it, like there isn't even a lot of hard boundaries sort of outside of like what is and isn't disability. We cross a lot into chronic illness.
Mm-hmm.
You have a lot of stories that are just about like the general shittiness of healthcare systems. And most people, even non-disabled people, have experience with healthcare systems, and it's not really sort of unique to a small group. So I think, yeah, it's really important to think of disability as like a huge, huge catch-all block, with sort of very gray, soft edges.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and something we have certainly kind of gotten into on this podcast of like with a mission like having all disabled writers or all disabled guests, you have to be really aware of that those gray edges and they're very blurry. And because I think that there's, and this is my personal opinion, but I don't think that there's any reason to make the disability label exclusionary because there are so many, like, it's such a unique experience. I'm always telling my friends who have, whether it's like mental illness they identify in or chronic illness, or like chronic pain, I'm always trying to be like, you can find community within the disability community. Like I'm always trying to bring people in, join the club because if the world wasn't built for you, you can understand this experience. And I think that the satirical way of writing that you do does help. Like, I think maybe there's people who would relate to Squeaky Wheel content and not realize that they would be relating to disability content, quote unquote, especially with the healthcare system that we have that is so inherently disabling, and causes so many people chronic health issues. Yeah, I think satire is a great vehicle for that. So I have a satire question because satire is very popular right now.
Let's
But
hear it.
if you've spent any time on TikTok, you might know that some people do not understand what that word means. And satire sometimes gets used as, well, I didn't mean it like that. It was satire. It's kind of the new, like, I was being sarcastic. Um, so my question is, what makes great satire to you?
Um, so I think there's definitely a lot of things that go into it, but the first one that came to mind is I am not one of the comedians who enjoys fooling people with satire into thinking it is real. I think that is like kind of like disgusting to sort of put that content out and intentionally trick people or try and bait people into thinking that sort of your fictitious story is a true story. I make it very clear in every sort of platform we're on that like satire is right in the bio. It's on the front page of our website. We are not trying to convince anyone that our content is genuine. It still happens where people come across a story and mistakenly sort of think it's true or don't quite understand that it's supposed to be comedic, but it's not because we didn't make it clear. It's because they didn't really read it sort of thoroughly or take the time to actually check. So I think that transparency makes great satire in one way. The other thing that I think is sort of at the root of all satire is no matter kind of how absurd or silly or ridiculous the premise is, it's always alluding to truth. So it is explicitly fiction, it's explicitly not true, and it's explicitly trying to make you think of things that are true. So for the Thanos challenge for Ticketmaster, I don't remember the story exactly, but it's clearly not a true story. There's no one who thinks that Thanos is actually on the street, guarding the accessible seats. But it does immediately bring to mind, oh, it is so unnecessarily challenging to purchase wheelchair accessible seating for a event through Ticketmaster. So it's both that very clear fictitious nature and that very clear allusion to truth.
I'm
Those are kind of
so glad I asked you that question.
my
Me
two.
too.
I'm sure I could come up with a whole different answer if I thought about it more, but I'm sticking with it. I feel good about that one.
I think you should stick with it. I think that's a really good one because if your reader finding out, or your reader or viewer finding out that it's not true makes what you're writing not funny, I think it's not great satire. And I have seen too many people, especially like young, this is just one specific example of this, but like young male comedians who are with it and are woke, so their like misogynistic jokes are satire, and they're using satire as the vehicle to be like, man, it's so dumb when men hate women, haha. Like that's what they're trying to say, but it's like feels like they've just given themselves permission to then go on a misogynistic rant.
Yeah,
And
it's slippery. I think there's a lot of comedians that are like clearly doing that poorly, like you said. Um, I think maybe there's a world where that works, but like it works if you're getting away with it. If you're doing it and it's making people feel good and making them laugh, then sure. But like if it's making your audience feel bad or feel offended, like you're not doing it well. You're just doing it sloppy.
absolutely.
I
Yeah, I
think
think
too, one more thing that comes to mind on the kind of truth and fiction thing. As the sort of editor, I have the joy and challenge of approving and rejecting which headlines and submissions get published, and it is not something I take lightly because I always want to make sure that kind of I'm not just biased towards like my own personal sense of humor. And hands down, the two things that I'm always sort of pushing back against are headlines that I'm like, oh, people might think this is real. Like this is getting too close to like what actually happened. Or the reverse, where a lot of times we get people that write like, world's fastest wheelchair is a rocket ship to the moon. And I'm like, this could be funny, but like, I don't know what you're referring. Like, I don't
yeah,
know what truth this is alluding to. It's just sort of like a joke about a really fast wheelchair. Um, and then it's sort of always pushing them like, oh, maybe the rocket ship wheelchair is like escaping Earth because the climate sucks. I don't know. Like, they're trying to tie it back to something more grounded in reality, while still making sure it's transparently fiction.
Yeah, I imagine in today's misinformation all over the internet that you have to be very careful with like what you post and how you say it.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think I am probably more cautious than a lot of my comedian peers in that I really do sort of tread carefully in these very sensitive, risky areas. I'm sure you guys have seen yesterday there was a CEO of a major healthcare company that got shot. There's a lot of memes about it on the internet. There was a lot of discussion within the Squeaky Wheel group about like how do we handle this, and it sort of wasn't unanimous enough. And I'm like, let's just wait a beat and let's not give our 2 cents on this one. Let's try to give it a minute because again, there just wasn't enough consensus, and I'm fine. Like, so what? We don't get a few Instagram likes. It's not a big deal. Um, but I think then there are times where maybe things like the election, um, there was a lot more comfort within our writers team and like, okay, this is what we want to say. This feels good. We feel confident in it. We're going to put it out there. Most of the time, that strategy of being cautious when you need to and being bold when you need to works. On very rare occasion, it doesn't, and things backfire. And then it's just like, okay, we're not perfect. Like, we made a joke or a point that upset people, and it's because we're not the best at this, but we're doing our best.
I think that's such an important point, that like be cautious when you need to and be bold when you need to, because I think that some people, myself included, as like a young comedian in a world of like edgelords, felt like at one point in my life it was like I wanted to be the first to the joke, like I wanted to be quick. And like even making social media content for Easter seals, when something happens like in disability culture, sometimes it feels like we need to put out a statement right now, like we need to do this immediately, and it's almost never a big deal whether we post something the next day or the next week. And oftentimes, if we wait a week where we can then get a lot of different people in the community's input, it's better content anyway. But that was a hard thing to unlearn, because I think in today's world where something like the a billionaire being, where something controversial happens in today's world, you can very easily get on TikTok and make a video immediately. So the pressure is there to be fast with your comedy. But if you're a young comedian listening to this, taking a breath and stepping back before putting your thoughts in the public eye can actually be very beneficial.
Yeah, and I think different sort of people have different takes on these things because the circumstances are different for them. I know I keep mentioning The Onion. I love The Onion. I don't know if they've done anything on that yet, but they probably will if they haven't. They're usually very fast and they're usually very bold. And the reason The Onion can be so fast and bold is because they have millions of fans who know what they are and know what they stand for and agree with them and will be forgiving of them if they make a joke that they sort of disagree with. We are not at that scale. We could be squashed if we piss off the wrong big influencer. So we have to be a little more cautious, and like that's fine. I think there's other things that like we can be super bold and quick with because we know like we own certain communities sort of humor world. I don't mean we own them, but like we belong very much in certain spaces. So like if there is a Medicaid policy about pre-existing conditions, like we're gonna get to that joke as quickly as The Onion, or hopefully as well, because we know that world super well. Um, I think that other things like when the Supreme Court ruled to overturn Roe v. Wade, that was one where I was like, this is kind of a disability issue for various different reasons, but when we do our take on it, we need to make sure that like we're staying in our lane, which is how does the Roe v. Wade decision affect disabled people? And we let reductrists talk about how it affects women, because that's what they do best. Um, I think that like that is really important of knowing like when it's your turn to make the joke.
That, yeah, that's such a great point, especially in like a TikTok world where it's very easy for content to stumble out of your lane and be taken completely out of context. Yeah, I think that's it also shows, like, I think an important thing you're doing as an employer of disabled people, and specifically disabled writers in this space, is by having that extra layer of caution. You are, like, not sacrificing your writers to the trolls for the sake of clicks, because you very easily could do that, and you could get all the impressions because of people hating on your writers. And I think it shows a really important amount of care for your writers as their editor, and I think that's really respectable.
Yeah, and I think in that sense too, that's one of the sort of beautiful things about satire and fiction, is that, like, we have a very strict, you cannot write about your own life or family by name in a Squeaky Wheel story. That is a no-go. And the reason for that is because I don't want the trolls get into them. You'll also notice that at the end of our stories where we mention the writer's name, a lot of times they have a lovely little cartoon of our writer, like a little illustration. And the reason for that, how it started, was because I didn't even want to put their actual face next to these stories, because I was like, I think people might be a little more quick to attack if they see the face. If they see a cartoon, it feels almost like it's coming from a fictional character. So it feels a lot less threatening and a lot less appetizing to kind of troll.
Yeah, we did the same thing for our first season of the podcast. We were like, if we're just getting started, we didn't do video, and we, on our website, it wasn't a picture of us, it was cartoons of us. And it was just a level of, like, until we know that we have, like, the safety of our community that listens to this, it's scary to put your face out there. And I don't regret it, and I feel incredibly supported by Easter Seals in it, but it can be scary to put your face out there in general. So I think that's a really great idea, the cartoon version. Well, before we run out of time, I brought up Easter Seals. This is obviously an Easter Seals podcast, and we like to spend some time on the Easter Seals pillars, areas we're working to bring equity and access to, which are community, health, education, transportation, and education. Did I say education twice? Was that all? I said education twice because I didn't say it in the right. Community, education, employment, healthcare, transportation. That's the order I normally say it in. And if I say the wrong one first, I can't get it out. But we were discussing what kind of pillar area we wanted to talk about with you. I wanted to start talking about where we've already kind of started to cover, but being an employer for disabled people as the founder and editor of this publication. Have you learned anything that you didn't already know when starting Squeaky Wheel about, like, having an inclusive workplace? And is there anything you would say to other publications that have not expanded to hire disabled writers yet?
That's a great question. I also want to preface this by being very transparent that while we are technically paying our writers, it is very small amounts. It is almost all of our budget, but our budget is quite small. So it's certainly not like a full-time gig or anything like that for any of our writers. But one of our early goals was to compensate however much we can. And I think one of the things that I learned in that is that people are really understanding of sort of budget limitations. I was very worried that, like, it would almost be more insulting to offer our writers such a small amount. And I'll just say, like, generally our stories, we pay $20 for everyone that writes a story. It's a very small amount. I'm fully aware of that. It's sort of on par with many of these other internet satire places. But I was really worried. I was like, is this more insulting than just asking people to volunteer their time to do it? And what I've learned is it's actually quite the opposite, that, like, people just feel appreciated, and they're like, I'm glad that you're at least acknowledging that, like, this is bringing value to Squeaky Wheel, and like, this is worth something, and it took time and effort and energy, and there's such a sort of deep history of disabled people not being paid for their contributions. And I think, if for nothing else, symbolically, it's very important that disabled people get paid for the work they're doing. I think that we're going to continue to scale as much as we can, and the bigger we get, the more we can pay people, the bigger opportunities we can provide. Um, all of that is sort of part of our trajectory. The other thing when it comes to employment is, I think, by adding a small bit of compensation, it adds a small bit of responsibility on the writers, which I think is really important as well, because a lot of times disabled people are presented with opportunities, sometimes through charities and elsewhere, where it's sort of like, oh, we don't really expect anything of you. You're just here as a bonus. And I think people do feel that, oh, if I'm going to get paid, I need to deliver on whatever I said I'm going to provide. And then it means like, oh, I can actually put this on my resume, or we have people that put it in their LinkedIn and things like that, because it does sort of raise it in a professional writing world once you add any bit of compensation.
Yeah,
Sorry
thank
if
you.
that's a boring answer.
It's not boring at all. One, I love the transparency. I think it's really important because I could see that it's very easy to say that, like, if you build it, they will come. Do your own thing, but
Yeah.
that is difficult. And I mean, we, even at the small comedy show that I do, it's like we don't have any way of making money through it, so we're not like paying people to do it, but we'll like film high quality clips for them, and then we try to do sometimes like pay what you can fundraiser type things for people. And it's that, like, when you're within a community, it feels like a safe space to kind of explore those, like, hey, we're going to do what we can with what we got spaces. Now, if Coca-Cola is paying someone, okay, I won't say that because that's a real brand. Now, if big name brand is paying someone like no money, and it's a big name mostly ran by non-disabled people, pay the disabled people contributing a ton. But from within our community, I think you're right that like symbolic little bit that allows someone to get their start is enough, because the work is important, even just like to have the squeaky wheel, to have things to laugh at for this community is important. So doing it in whatever way you can, I think is worthwhile.
Yeah, and we fully intend to sort of keep growing, and the more we grow, the more we raise, the higher those rates can be, and the bigger differences we can make. I'm super proud of, like, I'm pretty sure we just sort of crossed the $10,000 of money we've given to writers, which is like, that's a significant amount of money. Um, sort of little $20, maybe $100 here and there if it's a speaking gig or things like that, but like, that's $10,000 that we put in disabled people's pockets. That wasn't there before. We did an awesome partnership with Shorehands, that is like the uh, transfer lift company, and we were able to give away an entire transfer lift system that is also, again, like a $15,000 medical device. So like, again, we're doing our best to sort of contribute as much as we can in those ways, and I'm very optimistic that like the more we do it, the more people will want to support us, and the more they support us, the more we can support our writers.
I love that. I love that so much, and I think you will continue to grow. That's amazing. Before we
Thank
wrap,
you.
Erin, do you want to ask one last question on the other Easter Seals pillar we wanted to talk about?
Sure. So we do a lot of work in education, early education, all through adulthood. So I'm wondering, what was your experience like growing up with education?
Like my personal experience,
Yeah.
um, Sure, so I think sort of an interesting tidbit is for kindergarten. I went to a very large school for students with disabilities, Henry Viscardi School, in Long Island, New York. I then pivoted into public school for the rest of my school years and eventually went to a pretty big public university for college. I think that like my experience as a disabled person was often very heavy on the social elements of school. So I feel like the opportunities I had were like pretty accessible and fair in terms of like classwork and assignments, and I had pretty good relationships with my teachers and the school faculty. Um, but I think it was always very challenging in a social way to like be in a public school where no one looked like the way I looked and no one sort of was dealing with what I was dealing with, and I didn't have um, as many peers that could relate to my experiences. So I think that education for me, again, like it was really empowering, and I think I'm only where I am because I had access to really good education. Um, but sort of as a disabled person, I think it's really important to make sure that disabled children, especially, are like social and have those social skills. Because I think that it really goes hand in hand, and social skills and friendships and peer relationships are like a really important part of the educational system that disabled people aren't often given the same access to, and that we don't think about when we talk about schools being inaccessible. We often don't think about like, is recess accessible, and what does it mean for recess to be accessible? What does it mean for lunchtime to be accessible, and who's eating with who, and things like that. I think are part of education because they're part of the education system.
Right. You learn a lot outside of like the lessons in school. How to be social, how to handle like fights or great moments. It really, school is more than learning like math.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep, totally.
Yeah, and I do think that gets sometimes left out of conversations around education for disabled kids. It's like it gets the heavy focus on the like learning the curriculum, but what about all that other stuff? I know that that's a big reason that our affiliates that do like camp programs love their camps so much, because it's like
Yep.
these awesome memories that kids get to make together, and that's where a lot of growth happens and a lot of learning happens. Thank you so much for coming on our show.
Thank you for having me. Also, before I go, I just want to say I love, love the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge.
Yes.
My friend Nick Novicki, our writer Anna Packman, works a lot with them.
Cool.
Rebecca Handler, all sorts of people I know who are very involved in that project. It's super cool. One day I will have the time and energy to be a part of it, but until then, I'm just their biggest fan. So shout out to the EDFC. Did I say that right?
Yeah, EDFC.
Yeah.
Yeah, the film challenge is phenomenal. Nick Novicki, one of our original guests on the show. Rachel Handler's a regular blog contributor.
Oh my gosh, I said Rebecca Handler, but yes, Rachel Handler. My bad.
Oh yeah, I just heard, I just corrected in my brain and heard, but yeah, it's such a great community of incredible people. Thanks for that shout out. And it's making waves like in changing the way we see disability representation in Hollywood. It really is. So love that shout out. And thank you so much for being on our show. We'll have links to the Squeaky Wheel and so you can find the publication and the social media sites in the episode description of this episode. Listeners, thank you for tuning in. We're so grateful for you. Erin, thanks for being my co-host. I love you.
Yeah. I love you.
And we will see you next time on another episode of Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong.
If you liked what you heard, go ahead and subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you to our listeners, and as always, thank you to Easter Seals for giving us the space and resources to share such authentic conversations from within the disability community to our listeners.
And we'll see you next time for another episode of Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong.
Everything you know about disability is wrong.
This is a podcast brought to you by Easter Seals.
You know, we actually work for Easter Seals, but maybe our listeners don't know what we do.
That's true. Easter Seals is leading the way to full access, equity, and inclusion for disabled people and their families.
And did you know we've been doing this for more than a century?
This includes helping disabled people find meaningful employment and addressing healthcare needs for all ages.
We're proud to serve communities across the country and ready for the next 100 years. For more, check out easterseals.com.